A new book called White Thinking, the French title is La Pensée Blanche, has been authored by the World Cup winner Lilian Thuram. And I'm delighted to say that Lilian is with us now, with his translator David Murphy, to talk to us about this book. You're both very welcome, and thanks so much for joining us today. Lilian, if I might start with you, the Irish people watching and listening and consuming this will obviously know your career as a footballer and will have been very familiar with your success on the field. Can you talk to us a bit, before we get into the book itself, about when you became an activist, when you realised that spending time speaking about the issues that you cover in your book was something that you wanted to do?
I always say that my first steps as an activist came when I was very young, and I became conscious of my blackness. Because I was in school in Paris, just 9 years old, and I was racially insulted by classmates. And so I became conscious of these issues very early in my life.
You speak in the book about that experience as a child, where you were unaware of the fact that the terms you use are melting pot and diversity was your day-to-day existence. You were kind of unaware of that until you moved properly as a footballer as well, when eventually there are some of your teammates who are surprised by you and your character. They say, "We thought you were just a thug." That, I presume, is all part of this awakening where you begin to realise your otherness, or how you are being othered, to be more technically correct.
Effectivement, je dirais que...
Yeah, I played for a team called the Portugais in Fontainebleau on the outskirts of Paris. And it was renowned as a sort of middle-class team, kids from, who lived in nice houses. And I came from the high-rises, and there were prejudices against kids from that sort of high-rise background, that they were poor, they were thuggish. But I had prejudices too towards the kids who were middle class, that I had certain views of what they were like. And it taught me early on that I needed to face up to these prejudices, and that we all have them in different ways, and that we need to be aware of them if we're to...
Ça m'a permis vraiment de comprendre qu'il faut faire très très attention aux préjugés que nous pouvons avoir nous-mêmes.
And that's the very point of the book. One last point about your time at Monaco. You speak about the players in the showers, we would say, slagging each other over the degrees of blackness that they have, and then also the experience that you have when you bring your girlfriend, who is the mother of your two boys, to meet them for the first time, and they're surprised that she's not white.
En fait, ce qui est très intéressant, lorsque j'ai commencé à m'intéresser au racisme, j'ai compris que c'était une façon de penser le monde.
I started to become interested in racism. I realized that racism was in effect a way of seeing the world. It was a sort of whole mentality. And I realized that racism was a form of cultural inheritance. It was something that had been passed down to us from slavery and colonialism. And it was something that affected the way Black people thought too. So in the Caribbean, where I come from, lighter skin is more highly valued than black skin, and there are all sorts of local expressions that talk about that value of lighter skin. So above all, what I've discovered is that racism is political. It's a desire to impose your will over and domination over other people. And this is what we need to get away from.
C'est avant tout une volonté politique, c'est avant tout une façon de conditionner les gens à accepter l'exploitation d'autres. Et encore une fois, comme ça dure depuis des siècles, donc ça veut dire que chacun de nous portons en nous des préjugés racistes, très souvent sans le savoir.
And what we need to talk about, and that's the trigger for the book. You talk about being asked to be involved in a show about racism and colonialism in France, and you're the only person of colour, the only black person in the room. When you start pointing that out, people become uncomfortable, and the exhibition doesn't happen. So the book is the product of that. This, I suppose, what I'm trying to reach here is that your individual experiences are manifestations of in your book, the argument certainly is centuries of colonialism and ignorance on the part of white people about their privilege.
Alors, tout d'abord, l'exposition a eu lieu.
So the exhibition that I talk about at the start of the book did eventually happen, but it happened without me. I wasn't involved after the discussions we'd had that didn't lead very far. And the exhibition wanted to say quite simply that racism was bad, but it didn't want to go any further than that, to understand the mechanisms that produce racism and why it exists. And I thought that was why I didn't stay involved, because it wasn't pushing these questions that need to be asked. And I go back again to the insults that I received as a child, aged 9, that the kids opposite me insulted me racially by saying I was a dirty black, which obviously meant that they were positing themselves as white. And I realized that the whiteness they were talking about was a construct. It was something invented. It wasn't to do with the whiteness of their skin, because when you look at it, nobody is white like a sheet of paper. It's not that color white, it's what's the meaning behind whiteness and how it's opposed to blackness and other racial minorities. So for me, whiteness and racism, they're a trap, a trap that we fall into that causes us to break the solidarity that might exist between human beings on all sorts of other levels. But it creates difference where there should be commonalities, and that's what I want to fight against in my book and in my activism.
Et ça a continué pendant la colonisation. Et donc l'idée, c'est vraiment dire aux gens, ne tombez pas dans le piège du racisme, parce que c'est un leurre. La seule chose que nous devons défendre, c'est le fait que nous sommes tous des êtres humains et nous devons lutter pour la redistribution financière du monde, parce qu'en fait, c'est ça le vrai problème.
And those are exploited by various forces, and that's captured very well in the book. I thought it very interesting, particularly at this moment in Irish history, where you're comparing the perception of masculinity with the colonial powers, and how misogyny is at the centre of a lot of the masculinity and how it's defined by the people who also defined what whiteness is. Where in your head did that link come from? And I mean, obviously I've read the book, so I know, but for people who are listening, why did you make that comparison?
Parce qu'encore une fois, je pense que
I often talk about the domination of men over women, because I think it's the most fundamental form of domination or discrimination that we see across the world in all different societies, through all different religions. We have seen this, and we see the same mechanisms at work in racial thinking, the domination of the world over people of other races from around the world. And in my own country, France, there were racial laws in place that cemented a hierarchy of the races, with the white race at the top, for over 250 years. So these are the cultural legacies that have been passed down to us. And the domination of men over women is the most fundamental form of that. And I think women understand this system of domination far better than men do. When we speak about sexism or sexual discrimination, it's often seen as a problem for women, and that this is an issue that women need to face up to or address. So, for example, if we look at a committee or something, and we see that there are 20% of women, we talk about there being 20% of women involved, but we don't look at the 80% of men who are involved, and that over-representation, that domination of men in these contexts. And it's the same with the domination of whiteness in the world, that those who dominate are rarely questioned. So that domination of men over women is a very good example to use.
Par exemple, on va dire que c'est très très bien, il y a 20% de femmes. Mais on ne va pas dire qu'il y a en fait, il y a un problème parce qu'il y a 80% d'hommes et que c'est trop. Et donc en fait, avec le livre aussi, j'ai voulu à un moment donné changer de point de vue. C'est-à-dire regarder à qui profitent les discriminations. Et effectivement, ce changement de point de vue peut déranger les gens qui n'ont pas l'habitude d'être regardés, d'être analysés, n'ont pas l'habitude qu'on questionne leur catégorie et montre que leur catégorie participe à alimenter ces discriminations, donc vous êtes un homme, et participe aussi à alimenter le racisme lorsque vous êtes une personne blanche.
And trying to change the point of view by asking the question, who benefits from the discrimination, is a theme that comes across very much in the book. And I suppose it's layered on the context of colonialism, and particularly in your book, in French colonialism and the history of French colonialism, which I think a lot of Irish listeners will be unfamiliar with, just how brutal and violent and nasty the colonisation that France inflicted on many parts of the world. When we were children learning French in first year in secondary school, the French book opens up with a map of the world, the European map obviously, with all these countries dotted around speaking French, and it's a selling point for the language, is how we will be able to visit the world and speak French in all these countries. And it didn't dawn on me as a 12-year-old that they were all speaking French, because French people went there and brutalised the native indigenous people for money, for natural resources, and in some cases for human capital, to enslave them.
Il a dit quelque chose de très intéressant tout au début. En fait, la question c'est qui profite de ce système.
The question you mentioned there a minute ago about who benefits from this domination is a really interesting one. Because if you look at colonial situations, it's not all French or Italian or British or white people who benefit from racism, slavery, colonialism over the centuries. It's politicians, rulers, commercial interests who benefit from them. And if you look at the world at the moment, it's something like the 10% that are richest have 80% of the global wealth. And in order to protect their position and this wealth, they set people at the bottom end of society against each other. So the poor white people of one country are set against the immigrants, are set against those who are poor in Africa or whatever. And that the common interests that those people might have are pushed to one side in the name of this construction of race. And that race is this thing that gets in the way of potential solidarity. And that's a lot of what my book wants to talk about, is how we move beyond that situation and take off these masks.
De la population mondiale détient, 10% des personnes les plus riches au monde détiennent plus de 80% des richesses du monde. Ça n'a pas de sens. Et en fait, depuis des générations et des générations, les gens exploités, qu'est-ce qu'ils demandent? Une redistribution des richesses. Et comme les plus riches ne veulent pas une redistribution des richesses, ils construisent des discours qui renvoient les plus pauvres à s'affronter sur des concepts qui n'ont pas de sens, de couleur de peau, de l'origine, de la religion. Et donc, c'est pour ça que je dis, il faut qu'on ouvre les yeux et qu'on puisse se dire, nous sommes des êtres humains et nous devons exiger la redistribution financière pour tout un chacun. Voilà.
It's an excellent time for me to ask, how do we move beyond it?
Tout d'abord, il faut prendre conscience que c'est...
First of all, we need to be aware that the West, and by the West I mean politicians, big business, the West sees the resources of the world as there to be harvested solely for the benefit of the West, that it's a resource to be exploited by the Western world. And there's a major environmental question here. You hear more and more this sort of discourse emerging from the ultra wealthy that say, well, if we ruin the planet, we can go off and live on another planet, and investing billions into programs to see can we go and colonize Mars or wherever. But it's not the vast majority of the population of the West that's going to be able to do that if we ruin the planet and exploit all the resources and cause environmental catastrophe. So it's the dominant interest of the politicians and the business people who control the propaganda within the West about how we see the world. And we need to denounce that propaganda, that whole way
of looking at the world as a resource that's ours to exploit here in the West, and to create those forms of solidarity where we see the other people on other continents as fellow human beings who are worthy of respect and who share a common future with us.
Et refuser ces systèmes économiques violents. Mais le problème, c'est que ceux qui détiennent le discours, et depuis des siècles, et qui construisent le discours, ce sont les personnes ultra riches. Parce qu'en règle générale, ils détiennent les moyens de communication. Et donc, ils peuvent orienter aussi la masse. Mais c'est quelque chose qui est très connu, c'est-à-dire la propagande d'État ou la propagande du capitalisme est d'une puissance extraordinaire.
Lilian, when you say these things and when you write this book and you host the exhibitions that you've hosted in the past, what is the response of the public? Do you still have the same experience as you did in that room full of white people where they shift uncomfortably and they don't really want to listen, or have things changed?
La réponse est assez simple, c'est-à-dire que les gens qui prennent le temps...
So people who take the time to read the book and to look and engage with the exhibitions that I put on, they can understand the logic of what I'm trying to do. And you often feel that reaction with them that, oh, I hadn't thought of it like that. I just hadn't conceiving of the relationship between the races or world history in this way. It's like with the story of Christopher Columbus. I often go into schools and I talk to the kids about Columbus and the discovery of the Americas. And I think, well, I say to them, you know, who are you with when you see Christopher Columbus arriving? Are you there on the beach with the so-called Indians, or are you there on the boat with Christopher Columbus? And why do we think Columbus discovered the Americas, if there were already people there? And you get that reaction from the kids in the classroom saying, "Oh, I hadn't thought about it like that. How could you have discovered it if the people were already there in the first place and lived there?" And so this is what I tried to do in my work, is just present some basic facts that get people to think about the world differently. And of course, there are some people who don't want to do that and who refuse to read the work and denounce it before they've even read it, who just don't want to engage and who want to protect the way things are now. And yeah, that's something you find across the world, those people who see change as difficult and don't want to engage with it. Yeah. So we shouldn't be naive, because there are always people who benefit from a system of domination. That even under slavery and colonialism, there were people who made their living off that system and defended it against calls for justice. And we look at people who we consider now as great heroes, like Mandela or Martin Luther King, that they were imprisoned in their time, that their calls for justice were denounced. And so these are things you have to keep fighting against and realize that there are some people who don't want change because they benefit from the system the way it is right now.
Is there any role for sport to play in helping to improve society when it comes to the issues of race particularly?
We shouldn't be naive about these things, because professional sport essentially sells a capitalist vision of the world. But I think sports people can use the platform that they have to help bring about equality by speaking out about injustice and domination, and using that platform to reach as wide an audience as possible to engage with these issues. It's a difficult situation to be in, and this comes back to something I was saying earlier on, that it's not easy to denounce a system that you personally might benefit from.
Et en même temps le dénoncer.
But for all that, it's actually more powerful when they do denounce the system that they're benefiting from. And so we see right now countries buying football clubs and staging big fights, boxing matches, bringing tennis players to sports wash. And it's very important that we realize what's happening and how sport can be used for those things.
It's up to each of us to understand the world as it is, and to understand how it operates if we're going to do anything about it or to change it. But we live in a world of advertising and marketing, and this is really obvious around football, where it wants to sell an image that fans can buy into. And we see a world where money has become perhaps the dominant value above all other values. And this is a very dangerous situation.
Mais on ne sait pas la réalité de ce qu'il y a derrière. Et donc peut-être qu'il faut se questionner si nous n'allons pas dans un monde de plus en plus superficiel où en fait on ne se pose pas de questions. Est-ce qu'on n'est pas dans un monde hyper dangereux où en fait l'argent a pris le pas sur toute autre valeur?
I have one last question. Having, tried to deal with the issues of colonialism in the book and the understanding really of how many people in France don't understand their own history, don't know their own history, aren't taught their own history. In retrospect, was there an opportunity after the team won the World Cup in '98 to unify the country, or was that also just a big lie?
Non, ça n'a pas été une occasion perdue parce qu'en fait,
the victory in 1998 was a lost opportunity, because in many ways that victory made these discussions around the legacies of slavery and colonialism more legitimate. It gave them a space in which they could occur in France. And 1998 was the 150th anniversary of the abolition of slavery. And this was something very important for the Caribbean players on the French team, and it allowed them to speak about this in a form where more people were aware of this. Now, what politicians do in these contexts is another matter entirely. There can be these debates where we try and talk about these things, but politicians in France at the moment, they thrive on division. And there's a lot of capital to be made from attacking immigrants. And the idea of changing the education system so you could look more squarely at what happened in the past and what the realities of French history and colonialism and slavery really were. That's very difficult to do in France right now, but that doesn't mean that 98 didn't lead to a wider discussion in society. And what we have right now is politicians trying to create division and lead people away from the true financial issues.
Et que l'argent ne soit pas capté par une minorité, voilà.
And when you speak on these issues, Lilian, do you find your audience is actually among football fans as well, that you have an opportunity there to make them stop for a bit longer than perhaps if you were just an academic or just an author?
Ben écoutez, oui, bien sûr, c'est une évidence. C'est-à-dire que
yes, of course. If you were interviewing me today on this show, it's because I was a high-level footballer, won the World Cup and so on. And this has provided me with a platform where people want to talk to me and to interview me and to listen to what I have to say. And it's really important when you've got this platform to think about what it is you want to say and what change you might be able to bring about. And I've always used the likes of Muhammad Ali as a model for what you can do with this platform to speak about harsh truths about society and difficult conversations that need to be engaged with, and how we can bring about change and a more equal world.
Should more current players speak out?
Écoute, en tout cas, le travail que je fais.
The work I do is designed to educate young people, whether they're footballers or not, about these issues. And I want to teach young people that there always have been figures who stand up to denounce different forms of injustice, and that they give us a model that we can follow to bring change. So yes, the more people who speak up, the better.
C'est-à-dire que s'il y a le droit de grève, s'il y a le droit de vote, c'est parce que dans tous les pays, il y a eu des gens, à un moment donné, qui se sont levés et qui ont demandé plus d'égalité. Donc voilà pourquoi il faut inciter les joueurs de foot, jeunes, connus ou pas connus, à prendre la parole pour organiser la société de demain.
Well, the book is difficult to read. It's important, it's arresting, it's shocking in parts, and it's very thought-provoking. It's called White Thinking. Lilian Thuram, merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup à vous.